Okay, hi, this is Elliot Fishman, and welcome to our weekly Facebook Live. We missed last week. It wasn't that we missed it, but I know everybody was away. So we decided not to do it, and now it's January 3rd, so we're in the new year, 2019. I hope everyone had a pleasant holiday season. I wish everybody a happy and healthy 2019. So, I think some of us went away. I went with my family and saw some fish. We're in the Cayman Islands. I didn't really see any fish, but I did see one gigantic fish. I don't know what it was, but it scared me from going in the water. But anyway, they had big mosquitoes also. I mean, the Cayman Islands never has mosquitoes because there's no Zika virus there. But these mosquitoes, I mean, we killed one and it had more blood. I thought I'd be dropping hematocrit, but no. Speaking about hematocrit, I guess maybe that's a good transition. And I picked the topic of GI bleeding, and I don't know why, but over the holiday season, right before the holiday, I was on nights, and we had an incredible number this past month or so of GI bleeders at Hopkins. And, CT has become the standard of care. If you say rule out GI bleeding, CT is the way to go. Now, typically, we talk about upper and lower GI bleeding. With upper GI bleeding, really, typically endoscopy is what you do because most of the time it's things related to varices or it's things to the stomach, like a gastric ulcer. So endoscopy is really good. But I will tell you that we have seen a number of cases where we made the diagnosis because when you say GI bleeding, people really aren't certain where it is, and now CT becomes the first study. So I've seen several cases of esophagitis with obvious bleeding in patients with really severe esophagitis. A couple of them were patients who were cirrhotic, and so you had big gastric varices and esophageal varices, but a few others were really markedly thickened esophagus, no varices, but you can see bright enhancement of the mucosa, and then what looks like some high density in the lumen, and that was active bleeding from severe esophagitis, and the patient eventually had endoscopy and proved this. I've seen cases of GI bleeding in the stomach. Remember, a tumor like a GIST tumor can bleed. Adenocarcinoma can occasionally bleed, or you'll see bleeding. But these were cases with very small ulcerations. Focal thickening was actually GI ulcerations in the stomach. And similarly in the duodenum. So although we don't think about CT as being the study of choice, and perhaps it's not for upper GI bleeding, endoscopy is the way to go, it can be very successful. And what I'm getting to is that if you're doing a GI bleeder, you don't know where the bleed is. Maybe you're guessing based on some clinical history, patient's older, maybe statistically it's diverticulitis, but I think you need to do is a very good prep. So you need to distend the stomach, give 1,000 cc's of water. That also distends the duodenum. If you don't have the stomach distended, you're going to miss the presence of an ulcer, and you're going to miss it in the duodenum as well as calling false positive, gastric wall thickening, and things like that. We also do dual phase imaging. We don't do non-contrast. Now, again, people recommended non-contrast for GI bleeders because if you had some high density material in bowel, perhaps you confuse it with a source of blood. But the reality is when you do arterial and venous, a bleed always changes. When it's high density material, foreign matter, it never changes from arterial to venous. Sometimes we can see the blood obviously on arterial and venous, though I've seen more cases now where it's subtle on arterial and very obvious on venous. And when you see bleeding from arterial to venous where it changes, those are the patients often who will have positive angios and who embolization really is very helpful. So I really do like the dual phase imaging, fast injections, 5 cc's a second, 100 to 120 on the 350 or Visi 320 works really well. And 1,000 cc's of water becomes very, very critical. One of the things also, which we've spoken about, and you could look at some lectures on CTisus, is when you're looking for bleeding, I think often you can see it on the axial views, but at times you could be underwhelmed by it. So looking at coronals become very critical. Looking at MIP imaging becomes very critical. Sometimes the high density material just shows on the MIP. Then you look back at the axials and coronals and it's surely there, but maybe you weren't that impressed by it on the first pass. So I think MIP imaging becomes very important. So whether you're doing on a workstation, sliding MIPs and rotating through, or the technologist is creating a slab, maybe a slab of 5 to 10 millimeters works very nicely. And make sure in addition to coronals and sagittals, you look at the MIP imaging. Now, in terms of the sagittals, the best thing about the sagittal is looking at the vessel. So in patients where we're looking at the possible bleed or other processes, you can see if there's stenosis of the celiac or SMA. You also can better appreciate the caliber of the vessel. Sometimes patients are hypotensive, the vessels are very small. So it's something that you can get a lot of information from. So it's critical: axials, coronals, sagittals, 3D, and a minimum MIP. We also like volume rendering, which looks at the volume of data and can be very helpful for picking up small tumors that are sources of bleeding, like carcinoids, but especially just tumors. And again, if you don't do a good protocol, you're not going to do very well for this. Now, we have seen cases where CT is positive, and obviously most of them angio is positive, but sometimes CT positive, angio negative. And that's not uncommon. It's not that CT is wrong. Bleeding often stops on its own. What we have seen, our interventional people, one of the great things about CT compared to, let's say, Nuke's studies, is that not only do we see the presence of blood, but we see exactly where the blood's coming from. And so you can plan your embolization in that regard. So we've seen, if I stick to small bowel for a second, we've seen ulcerations, okay? We've seen diverticulitis of the small bowel, that's fairly uncommon. We've seen a number of small bowel tumors. The one that comes to mind most is cyst tumors. The smaller ones are very vascular. They're also the ones that bleed. They don't cause obstruction. They can cause bleeding. You also can see carcinoid or even adenocarcinoma present with bleeding. You can see angiodysplasia. One of the nice things with angiodysplasia, multiple cluster of vessels, more common as jejunum, and then you see prominent feeding vessels coming to it. So that works out very nicely. The MIP is particularly helpful, but also volume rendering, really giving you a feel of those vessels, their location, and their involvement. So that becomes really good. And we do see a lot of small bowel bleeds, okay? And of course, the last is looking at the colon. You can see bleeding anywhere from the cecum to the rectum. Diverticulitis is common. Most patients don't have active bleeding, but you can see it. Again, a challenge, sometimes it's high density material that's stuck in diverticuli, but we usually see some change between the arterial and venous, so it's typically not going to be a problem. We also have seen small bowel tumors and large bowel tumors that present with bleeding. You can see intussusceptions. So you want to look very, very carefully, again, getting far beyond the axial imaging. When you look at the most recent results for the accuracy of CT, I think the accuracy is in the high 90% range. So if I do a CT study and it's a good study and there's no bleeding, I can say there's no active bleeding. Now, it is true, we know that patients' bleeding can stop and then starts again. That's always the challenge with GI bleeders. Remember, people with diverticulitis will typically only bleed once. They won't get a second episode of bleeding, and so most of them are never treated. But we will be, as I said, in the high 90% range when you do the protocol, when you look carefully, when you have the experience of both calling positive and calling negative studies. And again, it's important when you say negative, be certain it's negative. But again, as we speak, it's negative at the moment of the study. It doesn't necessarily mean an hour later it's going to be negative. And that's very much true about when it's positive. It's bleeding right now. I got a picture, but an hour later, if I go back with CT or angio, it's not bleeding. So at times, this will be a challenge. So pitfalls, poor injection, lack of gastric distension, overcalling high-density material that's been ingested as a bleed. You can sometimes see blood and appreciate blood in the bowel itself, more distally high density. Of course, you want to be careful that the patient didn't drink something like antacids or something that gives you high-density material. So you want to at least be thinking about that. Sometimes I'll see high density in the bowel, and that makes me say, okay, this patient must have a bleed. I better look harder and find it. And we can. I think in terms of other pitfalls, I think really it's the review of the data. It's the lack of reviewing the multiplanar and the 3D imaging. Is the lack of seeing something and assuming it's not there. You need to look very, very carefully. I'll look often 2 or 3 times, scrolling in different planes to really make certain that every bright spot I see on the study, I appreciate and I know where it's coming from and why it's coming from there. That becomes very, very important. Otherwise, you're going to have a study which doesn't have the sensitivity and specificity that clinicians are beginning to expect. So if you have a poor IV access, if you have a very slow scanner, you're going to have a problem getting really good results. So I think you have to really understand what the opportunities are and what the challenges are. So that's the GI bleeding. I'll give a few other perhaps pearls, and I'm about to post a bunch of these things on CTisus, and there's a lecture in the last few months on GI bleeding. One of the things, as I mentioned, was the dual phase acquisition, and things that bleed on both phases typically will change. If something doesn't change from arterial to venous, I know it's not going to be an active bleed, it's some foreign matter. If you still didn't believe me and you still thought it might be something, just wait 5 minutes to repeat the study. It's going to look identical. You could, of course, as we said, do non-contrast, but again, I want to minimize the dose of radiation to the patient, and so we will do that as well. So I think it's a very good topic, and hopefully I've kind of given you some ideas to think about. What I recommend you do is look at your protocols and look at the CTisus protocols, make sure you align. If you go to our small bowel section, you'll see a number of cases of GI bleeding. I think that can be helpful. If you do search GI bleeding, a lot of cases, both in large and small bowel, will show up. And again, the post-processing. As I mentioned, large bowel bleeding, very common. Older patients, diverticulitis is number 1, maybe colon cancer is number 2. Maybe you see some angiodysplasia or its equivalent in the large bowel. Sometimes we see very large rectal varices due to hemorrhoids. And so if you want to make sure you scan low enough, hemorrhoids can be very bright, but hemorrhoids can bleed. That's one of the most, that probably is the most common cause of rectal bleeding. Obviously, you want to make certain there's no tumor present, but very bright varices and active bleeding from the region of the rectum is something we need to look for. Again, diverticulitis is one of the possibilities. Colon cancer, ischemic bowel, not so likely. Excuse me. So those are all things we're actually going to look at. Now, what else could I possibly tell you? Again, look at some of the references, look at some of the cases. I think it's very important to look at a lot of cases. Cases do have variable appearances. I looked at 2 cases today with GI bleeding. At first, you would say, it's some foreign matter. Then you see the change from arterial to venous. So although most cases in my mind are fairly obvious, other cases are not so obvious. And I think you can have a problem making the diagnosis. So what else can I tell you? Well, I can tell you again, hey, Liliana, see Liliana has moved to Palo Alto or close to Palo Alto. Her husband's at Stanford, so we wish them the best out there. I think that one of the things we're going to focus on this year in terms of the Facebook Live, we will try to have interviews. I know people do like interviews. We have Keith Grossman from Bloomberg the end of the month, and hopefully he'll allow me to interview him. And he's giving an incredible talk at Hopkins on January 30th. So we look forward to that. If you go to JACR, on their Impress articles, there's an article by Reed Jobs. Reed is head of healthcare for Emerson Collective, and he was a visitor here. He's been a visitor many times, but he gave a talk a few months ago, and the talk has been written up and is in JACR. It's really an excellent presentation, and it's his first PubMed presentation. Reed's doing incredible things, Stand Up to Cancer, and a number of other things. And his article is very good, kind of telling you his perspective and what he's trying to do. and how he's trying to change the face of healthcare. And Emerson Collective, again, that's run by Lauren Jobs, is really doing incredible things across a spectrum of issues, from education to immigration, now to healthcare. So doing a lot of things. With that, I think maybe I'll stop. I know everybody's busy today trying to get caught up. Again, we'd be interested in if you have any topics and ideas and things to talk about. If anyone has any questions, I'm looking at my list. I don't have any questions. There's no good way of looking at Instagram. We have a lot of viewers and get questions. People can wave at me, I guess, but if you have a question, Facebook is the way to go. But I don't see any questions. So if you think of something later, we have a new Ask the Fish page just redone. You can post cases there. It's a really good new page. And if not, I'll see you next week. Same time, same station. Have a great week.